My name is Jensy, and I am reading some stories today written by Johann Peter Hebel from the book How a Ghastly Story Was Brought to Light by a Common or Garden Butcher's Dog. I'm going to read about 5 of these stories. They're pretty quick, so I'll read a couple and then we'll stop. The Sly Pilgrim. A few years ago, an idler roamed around the countryside pretending to be a pious pilgrim, saying he came from Paderborn and was making for the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And already, at the Coach and Horses in Mulheim, he was asking, "How far is it to Jerusalem now?" And they told him, 700 hours. But you'll save a quarter of an hour if you take the path to Mouchen. So he went by way of Mouchen to save himself a quarter of an hour on his long journey. That wasn't such a bad idea. You must not scorn a small gain, or a bigger one won't come your way. You more often get a chance to save or make 3 pence than a florin. But 8 3-pennies makes a florin, and if on a journey of 700 hours you can save a quarter of an hour every 5 hours, over the whole journey you will save. Now who can work that out? How many hours? But that wasn't how our supposed pilgrim saw it. Since he was only after an easy life and a good meal, he didn't care which way he went. As the old saying goes, a beggar can never take the wrong turning. It's a poor village indeed where he can't collect more than the cost of the shoe leather he has worn out on the road, especially if he goes barefoot. Yet our pilgrim intended to get back as soon as he could to the main road, where he'd find rich people's houses and good cooking. For this rascal wasn't content, as a true pilgrim should be, with common food given in compassion by a pious hand. He wanted nothing but nourishing pebble soup. You see, whenever he saw a nice inn by the road, for instance, the post house at Grosingen or the Basel Arms at Schleingen, he would go in and very humbly and hungrily ask for a nice soup made of pebbles and water. In God's name, he had no money. And when the innkeeper's wife took pity on him and said, "Pious pilgrim, pebbles are not easy to digest," he said, "That's just it. Pebbles last longer than bread, and it's a long way to Jerusalem. But if you would give me a little glass of wine too, in God's name, it would help me digest them." Now, she said, "But good pilgrim, a soup like that won't give you any strength at all." Then he replied, "Well, if you use broth instead of water, then of course it would be more nourishing." And when she brought him his broth and said, "The bits at the bottom are still a bit hard, I'm afraid," then he'd say, "You're right, and the broth looks a little thin. Would you have a couple of spoonfuls of vegetables to add to it, or a scrap of meat, or maybe both?" If now the innkeeper's wife still felt sorry for him and put some meat and vegetables in the bowl, he said, "God bless you. Now just hand me a piece of bread and I'll tuck into your soup." Then he would push back the sleeves of his pilgrim's habit, sit down and set to work with relish. And when he had eaten the last crumb of bread, drained the wine, and finished the last morsel of meat and vegetables and the last drop of broth, he would wipe his mouth on the tablecloth or his sleeve, or perhaps he wouldn't bother, and he'd say, "Mrs., your soup has strengthened me as a good soup should. What a shame I can't find room for the nice pebbles now. But put them by, and when I come back, I'll bring you a holy conch from the seashore at Ascalon or Jericho Rose." The Commandant and the Light Infantry at Hersfeld. In the last campaign in Prussia and Russia, when the French army and a large part of the Allied troops were in Poland and Prussia, a contingent of the Baden light industry was in Hessen and stationed at Hersfeld. For the Emperor had taken that state at the beginning of the campaign and stationed troops there. The inhabitants, who preferred the way things had been before, defied the new order, and there were several acts of lawlessness, particularly in the town of Hersfeld. In one incident, a French officer was killed. The French emperor was engaged face to face with great numbers of the enemy and couldn't allow hostilities behind his back or let a spark spread into a great fire. The unfortunate people of Hersfeld thus had cause to regret their rashness, for the emperor ordered the town to be looted, set alight at each corner, and burnt to the ground. This town of Hersfeld has many factories, and thus many rich inhabitants and fine buildings, and all of us with a heart can understand how its unfortunate people, those fathers and mothers with families, felt when they heard the dreadful news. The poor, whose possessions could be carried off in one pair of arms, were just as much affected as the rich, whose goods couldn't all be loaded on a train of wagons. Great houses on the town square and small dwellings in the alleyways are all the same when burnt to the ground, just like rich and poor in the graveyard. But the worst didn't happen. The French commandant in Kassel and Hersfeld interceded, and the punishment was reduced. Only 4 houses were to be burned down, and that was lenient. But the plundering was to take place as ordered, and that was hard enough. The wretched townsfolk, hearing this latest decision, were so cowed and robbed of any presence of mind that the benevolent commandant himself had to urge them, instead of weeping and pleading in vain, to remove their most precious possessions in the short time that was left. The dreadful hour arrived, the drums sounded over the wails of anguish, the soldiers hurried in their place of assembly through the crowds fleeing in despair. Then the stalwart commandant of Hersfeld stood before the ranks of the infantry, and first he painted a vivid picture of the sad fate of the townspeople. Then he said, "Men, you now have permission to loot. Those who wish to take part, fall out." Not one man moved, not a single one. The order was repeated. Not one pair of boots stirred, and if the commandant had intended the town to be plundered, he would have had to do it himself. But no one was more pleased than he that things turned out as they did. That is easy to tell. When the townsfolk learned this, it was as if they woke from a bad dream. No one can describe their joy. They sent a delegation to the commandant to thank him for his kindness and magnanimity, and offered him a handsome gift to mark their gratitude. Who knows what they might not have done? But the commandant refused and said he wouldn't be paid for a good deed. This happened in Hersfeld in the year 1807, and the town is still standing. A poor reward. When in the last Prussian war, the French came to Berlin, where the King of Prussia resides, a great deal of the royal property, as well as other people's, was taken and carried off or sold. For war brings nothing, it only takes. Much was claimed as booty. However well it was hidden, they found it, but not everything. A large store of royal building timber remained undiscovered and untouched for some time. But eventually a rascal among the king's own subjects thought, "There's a fair penny to be made here." And with a smirk and a wink, he went to tell the French commandant what a lovely stack of oak and pine logs was still at such and such a place, and it was worth a few thousand guilders. But the French commandant paid him badly for his betrayal and said, "Just you leave those fine logs where they are. There's no call to deprive the enemy of his most basic needs. For when your king returns, he will need timbers for a new gallows for trusty subjects like you." Your family friend can only applaud that, and he would make a present of a few logs from his own coppice if they were needed. A curious ghost story. Last autumn, a gentleman was traveling through Schlangen, a nice little place, And as he was walking up the hill to spare the horses, he told a man from Grenzach the following story of what had happened to him. 6 months earlier, this gentleman was on his way to Denmark, and late one evening he arrived in a village with a fine mansion on a hill outside, and he wanted to stay the night. But the innkeeper said he had no room. There was a hanging the next day, and the 3 hangmen were staying with him. So the gentleman replied, "Then I'll ask up there in the big house. The owner, the governor, or whoever he is, will take me in and find a spare bed for me." The innkeeper said, "There are plenty of fine beds with silk hangings up there already made up, and I'm in charge of the keys, but I wouldn't advise you to go there. 3 months ago, the Lord and the lady and the young master went away on a long journey, and since then the mansion house has been haunted by ghosts. The steward and the servants had to leave, and all the others who have been to the house never went back a second time." Our stranger smiled, for he was a plucky man who wasn't afraid of ghosts, and he said, "I'll risk it." Despite all the innkeeper's objections, he had to hand over the key. And after the traveler had put together what was needed to pay a visit on ghosts, he went to the mansion with his servant who was traveling with him. Once inside, he didn't undress or get ready for bed, but waited to see what happened. He put 2 lights to burn on the table and a pair of loaded pistols next to them. And to pass away the time, he picked up the Rhinelander's family friend, bound in gold paper, which was hanging by a red silk ribbon under the mirror in its frame on the wall, and looked at the nice pictures. For a long time, nothing happened. But when midnight stirred in the church tower and the clock struck 12, and a rainstorm was passing over the house, and large drops were beating against the window, there were 3 loud knocks on the door, and a ghastly apparition with black squinting eyes, a nose half a yard long, gnashing teeth, a beard like a goat, and hair all over its body, came into the room and said in a horrible growl, "I am the Lord Mephistopheles. Welcome to my palace. Have you said your goodbyes to your wife and children?" The visitor felt a cold shiver run up from his big toes over his back and up under his nightcap, and his poor servant was in a worse state still. But when this Mephistopheles came toward him, scowling dreadfully and stepping high as if he was crossing a floor of flames, the unfortunate gentleman thought, "In God's name, this is a test." And he stood up boldly and pointed his pistol at the monster and said, "Halt, or I'll shoot." Not every ghost can be stopped like that, for even if you pull the trigger, it doesn't go off, or the bullet flies back and hits you instead of the target. But Mephistopheles raised his finger in warning, turned slowly on his heels, and strode away just as he had come. Now, when our traveler saw that this devil had respect for gunpowder, he thought, "There's no danger now." Picked up a light in his free hand and followed the ghost cautiously along the passage. And his servant, who was standing behind him, ran for all he was worth out of this blessed place and down to the village, thinking he'd sooner spend the night with the hangman than with the spooks. But suddenly in the passage, the ghost disappeared from under the eyes of its plucky pursuer, just as if it had gone through the floor. And when the gentleman went on another few paces to see where it had gone, all at once there was no floor under his feet, and he fell down through a hole toward a flaming fire, and he thought himself on the way to hell. But after dropping about 10 feet, he found himself lying unharmed on a heap of hay in a cellar, and 6 weird fellows were standing around the fire that Mephistopheles with them. All sorts of strange implements were piled around them, and 2 tables stood heaping with shining thalers, each one more lovely than the next. Now the stranger knew what was going on, for this was a secret band of forgers, all with blood running in their veins. They had taken advantage of the owner's absence and set up their mint in his mansion. and some of them were probably servants of the house who knew their way about, and to make sure they were not disturbed and discovered, they wailed like ghosts, and anyone who came to the house was so frightened he never came back to take a second look. Yet the plucky traveler now had cause to regret his lack of prudence in not listening to the innkeeper's warning, for he was pushed through a narrow opening into a small dark room and could hear them deciding his fate. "The best thing is to kill him," said one, but another said, "First we must question him, find out who he is and where he's from." When they then learnt he was a man of consequence and on his way to Copenhagen to see the king, they looked at each other wide-eyed. And when he was back in the dark storeroom, they said, "This is a bad business. For if he's missed and they find out from the innkeeper that he came here and didn't leave, the hussars will come overnight and fetch us out. And there's plenty of hemp in the fields this year, so hanging nooses come cheap." So they told their prisoner they would let him go if he swore an oath not to betray them, threatening they would have him watched in Copenhagen. And he had to tell them on oath where he lived. He told them, "Next to the green man, on the left in the big house with green shutters." Then they poured him some Burgundy wine, and he watched them coining their thalers until it was light. When the morning light shone down through the gratings, and they heard the sound of whips on the road and the cowherd blowing his horn, the traveler took leave of his nighttime companions, thanked them for having him, and went gaily back to the inn, quite forgetting that he had left his watch and pipe and the pistols back in the mansion. The innkeeper said, "Thank God you're back. I didn't get a wink of sleep. How did you get on?" But the traveler thought, "An oath is an oath, and you mustn't take God's name in vain to save your life." So he said nothing, and as the bell was ringing and the wretched malefactor was being let out, everyone ran off to watch. He said nothing in Copenhagen either, and almost forgot the incident himself. A few weeks later, however, he received a parcel by the post, and in it were a pair of expensive new pistols inlaid with silver, a new gold watch set with diamonds, a Turkish pipe with a gold chain, and a silk tobacco pouch embroidered with gold, and in the pouch was a note. It said, "We're sending you this to make up for the fright we gave you and to thank you for keeping quiet. It's all over now, and you can tell anyone you like." So the traveler told the man from Grenzach, and it was that same gold watch that he took out at the top of the hill to check that the clock in Herdingen was striking noon on time. And later on in the Stork in Basel, a French general offered him 27 new doubloons for it, but he wouldn't part with it. It's an interesting ending. One word leads to another. A rich man in Swabia sent his son to Paris to learn French and a few manners. After a year or more, his father's farmhand came to see him. The son was greatly surprised and cried out joyfully, "Hans, whatever are you doing here? How are things at home? What's the news?" "Nothing much, Mr. William, though your fine raven copped it 2 weeks ago, the one the gamekeeper gave you." "Oh, the poor bird," replied Mr. William. "What happened to it?" "Well, you see, he ate too much carrion when our fine horses died one after the other. I said he would." "What? My father's 4 fine grays are dead?" Mr. William asked. "How did that happen?" "Well, you see, they were worked too hard hauling water when the house and the barns burned down, and it did no good." "Oh no!" exclaimed Mr. William, horrified. "Our house burned down? When was that?" "Well, you see, nobody thought of a fire when your father lay in his coffin. He was buried at night with torches. A small spark soon spreads." "That's terrible news!" exclaimed Mr. William in his distress. "My father dead? And how is my sister?" "Well, you see, your late father died of grief when the young miss had a child and no father for it. It's a boy. There's not much else to tell," he added. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed these stories. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks very much.